Is regenerative ranching the future? And more importantly, can we sell the environmental benefits to stave off the anti-livestock protests? That's what we're discussing in this episode of the Business of Agriculture. Hey, Damian Mason here with a question before we hop into this episode of the Business of Agriculture. If you farm for a living, you employ a lot of amazing technology, from your inputs that you put into the soil to the tractor that you sit in, your combine, the amazing data that it harvests. But has your soil analytics kept up technologically with everything else in your farming operation? I would venture to say that no, it is not. Sure, you check for your nitrogen, your phosphorus, your potassium, your micronutrients as well. But what about disease pressure? Do you know what diseases and what pests you're going to face next year? No, you don't. But you can now figure that out with Pattern Ag's predictive analytics. Think about it. They can tell you now with testing what the likelihood of facing nasty diseases, things like cyst nematode or sudden death syndrome, what the likelihood of you having this in your field. Then you know how to prepare, how to treat, and where to invest your money. It's using technology to make you bigger yields and therefore make you bigger money. Go to www.pattern.ag to learn more. They are pioneering the way in predictive agronomy. Hey there, welcome to another fantastic episode of the Business of Agriculture. Got a great show for you today. We're talking about regenerative ranching. We're talking about new practices and maybe even combining some old practices, good for the environment, and also can it be good for the bottom line? More importantly, will these sorts of movements where we talk about better health, better soil, better environment, by using livestock, can we actually sell that on to a public that's being constantly bombarded by the likes of the Bill Gateses or the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes telling us that livestock is evil and meat is bad? That's one of the things we're going to get into, along with everything else you need to know about what these practices are and why it's good for you, good for the bottom line, and why it should be something you're probably practicing on your acres. I've got Hugh, Aljoe, and Jim Johnson there with Noble Research Institute out of Oklahoma, and we are going to cover this topic in depth. Welcome to the show, guys. So tell us about Noble Research Institute.
Well, the Noble Research Institute was founded by, an industrial oil man that had an appreciation for the land itself. He understood that the people that were working in his company, the best workers he had, came off the farms and ranches because they understood and valued a day's worth of labor for a day's pay. But the reason why they were working for him is they couldn't make a living on the land itself. They wanted to keep the land in the family and be as productive as possible. And so he learned to understand and appreciate, the plight of the land. A lot of this land that here in Oklahoma that he's observed firsthand had been eroding away during the 30s and then again in the 50s. Of course, he passed away in 1950, but he had already seen what the evidence of the erosion and poor farming practices on land that should never have been broken to the plow had done. And keeping the people on the land was really important to him. So he wanted to build an organization that could contribute back to rebuilding the land. In fact, we've got a lot of words, a lot of things that he said to go back and say, we want to rebuild, revitalize, regenerate the soil. Well, we spent a long time here working with producers, 77 years now, where we have worked with farmers and ranchers to help them, better meet their own goals and objectives, which would be financial, land stewardship, livestock, whatever that might be. And through that period of time, as we all understood what were the best management practices that we all grew up with, oftentimes, had inputs coming in that would increase production, and when they were relatively inexpensive, could increase profitability. Well, as we begin to look at the changes that have occurred in agriculture, a lot of these inputs are no longer inexpensive. Oftentimes are difficult to pay for, and you begin to stack all the best management practices together, you're no longer profitable. So as you begin to look at and understand what we really needed to be able to do is how do we address management on our landscapes that can end up in a more profitable situations. Here recently, a lot of the research has begun to focus on understanding the biology within the soil itself. And as we understand the biology of the soil, the contributions that our native prairies have developed under for centuries that were able to maintain themselves, how can we begin to mimic our management in some degree to complement the practices that nature would have taken on its own had we not interfered in many regards. So as we begin to look at those and begin to look at the profitability, looking at the producers that have adopted this type of, we call it holistic management or regenerative management or whatever the term that people like to use, but really begin to look at land stewardship for improved soil health in these grazing lands. What we found is the guys that have been doing it for a long period of time, following the principles of soil health, were not only more profitable, but they're also more productive and have improved their lands over the time where they're bringing people back onto the ranches. So you begin to look at the track record of the people that have been doing this for a long time, sort of under the radar, and we begin to look at what the science is bringing forward. We just saw that there was an opportunity that was probably missing in agriculture to combine the science and the applied, bring it back to producers and let them make their own choice. We're not telling here, we're not going to tell them that one way's wrong or better. You got to figure that out for yourself, and not for everybody to start off across the entire operation. You pointed out.
Hey, Hugh, for a scientist, you just took a question and turned it into a 4-minute answer. Let's go over here to Jim Johnson. He's the soils guy. Jim's actually a fan of the business of agriculture, so we're happy to have him on here. I've said to my live audiences when we talk about the evolution of agriculture, a couple of things that I've always stood by that the average person, even in ag, doesn't think about. In 10,000 years of humans endeavoring in agriculture, we've made most of the strides in the last 100 years. And my buddy Rob Syke talks about Food 5.0, about the 5 iterations, from human muscle and draft horses and donkeys, whatever, to machines to chemistry. And the reality is, I believe the future. You talk about then the mechanization and then to the chemistry post World War II in particular with synthetic fertilizers and chemistry, 2,4-D obviously being one of the big ones come out of that. We're starting to get into biologicals. There's a whole bunch of companies that manufacture biologicals. 40 years ago, we would have thought that those were snake oil. And we're at this cusp. And we're not that far into it, to be honest. I don't think we're that far into it, at least, but I want your perspective. Where biology, we might know more about the surface of Mars than we do about this soil that's out here in this field behind my house in terms of biological molecular level. And that's where I think the great strides are coming next. Help me out here, Jim. Am I right?
I'd agree. Yeah, I started my career as a soil and crops specialist, plant breeding and chemistry, and knew everything about what you could pour out of a jug or a bag. But there's a lot of things going on in the soil that work for us for free if we'll let them. If we'll provide the habitat for that biology, maybe nurture it a little bit, it'll do a lot of really cool things for us for free. And we're just learning what a lot of those are.
Yeah, Gabe Brown wrote the book Dirt to Soil. He's sort of a pioneer out here, I guess, in the regenerative space. And I've heard him speak. And he does make a very valid point in his book. He says, for the last 40 years at least, maybe 50, maybe 60, certainly since the 60s and 70s, I'd say, we just thought about killing shit. It's all about killing shit. Let's go out here and kill stuff. Let's just go out here, spray it, kill it, spray it. And I'm, I just sprayed my driveway this morning with Roundup and sprayed under my trees with Roundup, with a glyphosate 2,4-D mix. So I understand that it's got its place. I also agree with him. We've looked at soil as killing stuff as opposed to nurturing stuff. So are we starting to see the switch? I mean, you are there at Noble Research Institute. When you're out here traveling around, are we seeing it?
We're starting to, but we still have a lot of room to grow. There's still lots and lots and lots of conventional. There's a reason we still call it conventional because it is the norm. Regenerative is not conventional yet. I hope one day it is what we consider conventional, no-till and mimicking nature. I hope will be things that everyone is doing.
So, Hugh, the work you're doing there at this institute, it sounds a bit like it's kind of university, but it's maybe more practical, or it's not large chemical companies coming in and funding your stuff. So you've got the money in an endowment from the founder. You can do kind of what you want. You're not tied to trying to prove that this thing works for one of your corporate overlord, so to speak. So kind of talk to me about that, like the work that you're doing that's different from what's happening down the road from you at Oklahoma State, for instance.
Well, the work that we're trying to do is really focused around what are the producer outcomes and try to put it in the perspective of a producer. The producer is going to have to manage through things that are beyond their control. The environment, the climate, as well as the cattle markets. All these things are impacting their day-to-day life. But when we start conducting research in the traditional sense, we try to take all that noise out. We're trying to manage in a controlled design. And where our research right here, we're wanting to look at the management practices themselves that we know are aligned with our soil health principles. And then let's monitor the changes over time. Which one gave us the biggest benefit on the certain soil types in this context that we're trying to operate within? As we're working with a native plant community, it's going to look a lot different than if it's an introduced pasture plant community, or if it's a forage cropland, or if we're trying to integrate crops into a landscape. So all these have applications to the producer, and those are the questions we want to try to answer. How do we have the biggest impact on soil health through management, in spite of all these other conditions that are out there, and not just rely on controlled design experiments?
I want to get it. Go ahead, Jim.
Hugh's being a little modest. We have 14,000 acres of ranches across the Love and Carter counties in southern Oklahoma that we're doing all of this on our own ranches.
Yeah. So 14,000 acres, this isn't a greenhouse, this isn't a lab. This is 14,000 acres. And the thing is, I guess you're saying, well, we want to show ranchers a better way, or, rangeland owners a better way. I like to always do a thing first off where I put it in perspective. I always make the crack that, I got my college roommate that's not an ag guy that listens to this. We have investors that listen to this because they want to know what's happening in agriculture in this space. And I always make the crack, there might be a cranberry processing person listen to this that doesn't know a whole hell of a lot about what happens in southern Oklahoma. Here's why it matters. There are 900 million privately owned acres in farm properties in the United States. 900 million farm acres. Only about 360 million of those, maybe 380 on a big year, 360 million of them are in crops. The bulk of America's farm acres are in rangeland, pasture land, like you're talking about. So that's number one reason why you should care. Number two reason why you should care, if we're going to continue to see a politicization of food, and it seems like it's not letting up. In fact, it's gaining momentum compared to when we were kids. And part of this is about livestock. I say that if the average person eating a hamburger tonight on their dinner plate understood that livestock, cattle in particular, can be actually a huge benefit in rejuvenating these pasture lands. In other words, a bunch of native prairie, that's cool. But if you actually are consuming the grasses and the legumes and whatnot in those pastures, and then they're growing, the vegetative growth then consumes carbon dioxide out of our atmosphere. Speak to that a little bit, one of you, because I don't think a lot of folks get that, even within our industry, that this is something we should be touting as properly done. We're actually a huge benefit for the environment with grazing animals.
Well, I'll get started, and Jim, you jump in when you want to. But to your point, there's about we use the terminology that there's about 654 million acres of grazing lands, of which most of those are in some sort of degraded condition. If we can learn to use those forage grazing lands much more effectively, to where we maintain a photosynthetically active plant throughout the time period during the growing season, that it can actually be photosynthetically active, which means grazing it off about the time when it's no longer photosynthetically efficient, and then letting it regrow, then we can begin to really bring in a lot more carbon out of the atmosphere. The other part of it is we begin.
Man, I want to point out that the person that's driving down the road is running their numbers. They're saying, damn it, Damian, you said 900 million acres and 360 of them are cropland. And now he comes in and says 650. Those numbers don't jive. I assume you're talking about some acres that are not privately owned. My numbers were 900 million privately owned, 360 of which are in cropland. You're saying there's another couple 100 million that are not privately owned.
Yes, sir. I'm talking about just grazing lands. You said 900 million. You said, and then the other 350 that were cropland. Yeah. The rest of it's all grazing land.
Yeah. So on those grazing lands, we've heard, and even the person that's from the suburbs, that ranchers overgrazed, and that's what caused such degradation of the environment. And there's some truth to that. And particularly like they talk about that with Bureau of Land Management properties, that you pay, $1 an acre or something on a federal lease, and then you stick your critters out there. but that's not happening. I don't get the impression that's happening to the degree it maybe once did. Aren't we already getting better at this whole grazing thing?
Yes, sir. I think there's a greater appreciation for what the land really is. And granted, there has been some abuse in the past, or we wouldn't be sitting here talking about it today. But what we've learned is that we can take too much. And for the longest time, whenever we had an agronomic crop of any kind, whether it be grass for grazing or whether it be a crop that we can make a commodity out of, what do we want to do? We want to be as efficient as we can, which means take all of it. Well, these grazing lands did not develop under those conditions. There had to be something going back to feed the biology. The biology fed the soil fed the plants. And we've taken that out, and we can't just put that back because the biology in itself is part of that whole ecology that we have to learn to appreciate. People have learned to appreciate the ecology more, and as a result, they've cut back on their stock numbers considerably. They've learned how to graze more effectively, and they've taken better care of it. But you still have the bad actors out there in the business.
Jim Johnson, a soil question, or maybe just any agricultural soil environment question. One thing that we talk about, or a little bit ago, Hugh said whether it's native species in these grass on these prairies or whether it's introduced species, does it matter in terms of the carbon? Does it matter in terms of? It probably matters in terms of herd health, of course. But it used to be you went out there and you planted Kentucky 31 fescue or something that we now know isn't worth a damn. So what should these grasslands? And I'm sure it varies geographically and climatologically, but in your part of the world, or say in my part of the world, what should these grazing lands consist of?
I think a good general rule anywhere is a diversity of plants and living roots as much as possible, and actively healthy growing plants. And the reason for that is because, again, all that biology, the bacteria and fungi and protozoa and all the things under the soil that we can't see without a microscope, they need that diversity. Their communities function just like our communities. They need all kinds of different folks helping each other out, and they're the same way. And so the more diversity we have in our plants, no matter where we are, the better we can feed those microbes, and the more of the good things they can do for us for free if we just provide them that habitat that they need.
I want to get to another question, speaking of the plant types, because I think that's a big question. And then I want maybe some prescriptive stuff. Before I do, while we're talking about the environment and we're talking about regenerative, I want to remind you, dear listener, that a company called Trutera, I've been working with them for this whole year now. Trutera is focused on supporting farmers at every stage of the sustainability journey. So Trutera can help you plan, make, and maintain a regenerative management practice to improve your agronomics and also to improve your economic and environmental sustainability. So you can learn more about this at TruteraAg.com. Trutera, Trutera, TruteraAg.com. They're a division of Land O'Lakes. They're legitimate. And you know what? Maybe you're already going to do some stuff. Cover crops, reduce tillage, which you probably should be doing anyhow for the good of your ground. There's ground in my part of the world right now selling for $15,000 an acre. So if you've got an investment that's worth $15,000, if you didn't pay that for it, that's what it's worth now. It's balance sheet stuff. Well, let's go ahead and help your balance sheet along by making the soil better. Cover crops, reduce tillage, maybe some nitrogen reduction, maybe some carbon sequestration. The truth is you can get paid. Trutera can help you make money for doing stuff you should be doing for your soil anyhow. TruteraAg.com. All right. Now I just did my pitch there. Answer me this, Hugh. We're doing a better job. What are you right now telling people when they come out to Noble Research Institute and you say, you know what we discovered over here on 500 of our 14,000 acres? We went in and did this kind of a mix, and we discovered that our cattle gain better. Because the argument is always, that's cool, it's good for the environment. Does it make me money? So what are you showing them that's not only good for regenerative practices, but also makes me money? I would think that the two have to go together, right?
The two have to go together. If you can't be profitable, if you're not profitable, you're not going to be sustainable. And that's part of what we want to communicate with people, is that we've got to look at what's really working. So the beginning thing, we want to talk with producers. Do you really understand your costs to begin with? You need to understand what your direct costs are relative to each enterprise. You need to understand what your overheads are. And then those big categories, the ones where you've got the most money going into it, or the big dollar values, are the ones where you're going to make the biggest impact. That's where you got to focus your management around. And for most cattle producers, where does that tend to be? on fertilizers and forage and hay and feed, the things that are going into the animals. So if there's ways that we can manage first so that we can cut back on those input costs, you've already helped your bottom line. Now, it's going to affect your revenue, so you've got to look at that as well. For us, a lot of the times, if we can just help producers have their calving and breeding season more aligned with what Mother Nature wants to do during the spring season anyway, you cut out a lot of those costs that we tend to stack up during the feeding program during the wintertime.
Speaking of which, I've always wondered, why are these silly ass beef people sometimes having calves in January? I can look out the window and get cold. And then I think about coming out of a 102-degree bovine and thinking, oh my God, what are they doing to me? Why don't these people calve like in April and May? Seems to me that would make more sense. What's the reason for the early calving?
You really get back to the point where everybody wants that heavier weaning weight, because traditionally people have tried to market at weaning. But if you're not marketing weaning, which gets back to your management of your land, if you were managing your cow herd such that you were expecting to carry that calf on up to heavier weights during the natural growth that can occur and not try to put so much input that's going to cost you money into the animal, and you end up with a lot more profitability anyhow. So that's some of the early things that we've tried to implement. Shift your calving season. Know your calves aren't going to weigh as much, but you're not going to be so heavily stocked that you can't carry those calves over to the next year, most years. Now, you get into a drought like we've had right now, of course, you're not going to be able to carry everything, but hopefully you're managing such that you can carry most of the calves to a heavier weight most years. And that's where you're going to find the profitability, because as we've done our studies, your net return back to your stocker or your grower enterprise is usually much greater than the net return back to the cow-calf enterprise itself.
All right, I want to go to the returns. Maybe Jim can hop in on this. I've read, and I'm pretty sure these numbers are real close, although I'm sure Hugh will then take my numbers and change them because he likes to do that. The average cow-calf herd, and I'm talking on the beef, so if you're listening to this and this is all new to you, in beef, we talk about cow-calf, and then they move from there into maybe stockers and backgrounding, and then they go and get fed. But the average cow-calf herd in the United States, I'm sure you've all seen Yellowstone. That's not normal, okay? What's really normal is it's like 31 cows. The average cow-calf operator in the United States has 31 cows. Granted, there's the Yellowstones that exist, or the King Ranch or whatever, that have, thousands and thousands of cows. But in general, you're talking about a very small number, which then means most people that have their 31 cows also have wife and husband work in town, right? Why? The reality is it's almost more of a semi-professional hobby. It's my impression that it's going to be hard to make big changes when it's that small, because the person says, well, why would I work that hard? I've got 21 acres over here of rough ground, and I don't make any money off my 31 cows anyhow. It's just kind of neat for me and the kids to go and do. There's some reality to change is hard when the person really doesn't have, they're not that economically vested, or it's more of a sideline. Am I right about this, Jim?
That is a common complaint, but we all know agriculture is a lot of work. And so if you're going to work that hard, wouldn't you rather make as much profit as you can? And that's kind of how I look at it.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. And I was a hobby guy. I didn't have cow calf, but I fed steers, and I had 18 to 20 every year. So answer me this: regenerative practices, if you're going by the book, require livestock, and yet you've got these people out here that telling us that cow farts are killing us, which is not true. And it's like this political movement that has decided that somehow cows are going to be their hill to die on, or they just want to use this as a, it's like the anti-chemistry crowd used DDT and the American bald eagle as their whole symbol. It's almost like cows have become the symbol for those that want to dictate human behavior under the pretend guise of climate change. So kind of talk to that, Hugh.
Well, if you just look at the different economic sectors, you've got the transportation industry, you've got the energy industry, you've got the industrial industry, housing and residential, and then you got agriculture. That's typically the five buckets that the government monitors.
Yep.
Well, the only one of those that can actually be a carbon sink is agriculture. It's 11%. All these others are significantly larger within that greenhouse gas emissions.
You say that agriculture in general is 11% of the greenhouse gas emissions?
in the U.S.
In the United States. Yeah. And so the difference is, as opposed to the factories, as opposed to the households, as opposed to the other categories you named, we're the only one that actually can bring more of that 11%. We can bring back way more than that and stick it down on the ground, to your point.
That's the point. And the beef industry is only 3%, within that 11%. So, there's a lot of opportunity for us to be able to use the cows as part of that the focus of we can do more with less in order to have a greater impact. And the key is what we've got to be able to do is take those grazing lands and make them as productive as possible. And what that begins with is we got to graze these forages that are these plants are the only thing that can take in the oxygen, the carbon dioxide out of the air, bring in the nutrients and the water from the land, make something that we can turn into a commodity. You take it from a plant, move it into a cow, and have a product that we can actually use. And then through that process, begin to accumulate carbon within the soil, as well as continue to build more plants. So we've got food that comes out of it. We got clean air that comes out of it, because that's where the oxygen is going to come in. And the more productive we make these lands through our management practices, the more actual leaf area, the more plants we're actually going to be able to produce over time. But you've got to cycle it. When the plant at some point begins to die back, that's probably a good time where we need to graze it, take it down, do something such that we can allow the opportunity for new leaves to form, and then we begin the cycle all over again. So we've got to keep it moving, and there's different parts of the country, you're going to have a longer growing season than others. You're going to be able to produce more on different type of soils. It's understanding what type of soil, what's the context, as we like to say, that you're going to have to operate within to where we can make the most change and benefit to the land itself. Then we can end up making a greater benefit to our atmosphere, to our greenhouse gas, and have that negative impact. And that's part of what our research is doing right now, is to try to monitor those changes that occur through different management practices, not only on our ranches, but in ranches across producers as well.
Jim, I'll go to you. You talked about diversity of species. The average person driving down the road doesn't think much about it, but out in that grazing land, more than one, if it's a monoculture, that's generally not as good for the soil. It may not even be as good for the cows. So what, four or five different things? You talk about forbs and legumes and grasses. What's a good grazing land look like?
Sure. You could look at functional groups like grasses, forbs, and woodies. And then amongst the grasses and forbs, warm season and cool season. And then another split within the forbs would be legumes and non-legumes. So right there, you're getting up like 6-7 different functional groups already, but just diversity, the more, the better. And what we've seen, this has been really kind of fun, and it's hard for science to prove, but we see it over and over, is our livestock are healthier grazing these mixed forages, just like you or I would be unhealthy if all we ate was ice cream every day. It's the same with our livestock. The more diverse their diet, the less mortality and morbidity we see in them. And that leads to profit.
Okay. What about, we just started learning, and this is within the last, few years where it became a thing, rotational. That the idea is you keep moving these animals, because if they stay in one spot, you're starting to do harm to you're degrading the resource versus complementing it. So done right. And then I've read articles about gang grazing, where they stick a whole bunch of cattle in a small area for like a day and then move them to the next one, First off, it's a bit more work. And let's face it, some of these people like to drive around and point out the window at the cows. They don't want to go out there and work with them. Is it catching on? Are we seeing more of this? Are you, some of the people that you work with, really doing the rotation and the ganging and all that stuff? Is it happening?
Yes, it is. And what we see is once they practice it for a year or so, they would never go back, because they find that it's less work and they have more time, because now the cows are controlling weeds, so they don't have to spray weeds. The cows are harvesting all the forage, so they don't have to bale hay. They don't have to haul hay. So there's just so many things like that. The cows are spreading fertilizer across the pasture, so they don't have to apply fertilizer. So they actually end up with more time in their day when they do it this way and let the cows do the work for them.
So the economics of it, if I wanted to buy, I just was asked by a banker 2 days ago, Damian, if I bought $15,000 an acre corn and soybean ground, does it pay for itself? I said, well, obviously it depends on what your down payment is, but in general, it doesn't. I mean, you couldn't just go and say, okay, I'm going to pay for this solely off of that. You got the appreciation. Is it the same way with pasture land?
Pasture land is going to be very similar. There's a reason why they say that within the ranching business, you got a cattle enterprise and a land enterprise. They're separate. Most people have difficulty having enough profitability to have a return back to the cattle, much less the land itself. But in these regenerative ranching operations that typically, that are operating well and have been at it for a while, they're able to have a larger return going back to the land and pay for land improvements. But to be able to pay for a property, there's very few people that are going to be able to do that, especially with the price of land that it is today. It's going to take some exceptional management and really some exceptional circumstances when you actually bought, some sort of reduced price that the seller was actually wanting to make sure that you had the opportunity to get into it well. Most people aren't going to stumble across those opportunities. They need to look at the cattle enterprise. Their enterprises, they're separate than the land itself.
When I think about the future, and I predict, unless the Bill Gateses of the world that are trying to tell us that we need to have a diet of synthetic beef, because he did say that in his interview with the MIT newspaper 3 years ago, and nobody else read the entire article. I read the entire thing. And then he goes on to say, rich countries like the United States should switch entirely to synthetic beef for the good of the environment, climate. And then he got on one of his 4 private jets and flew around the world. But anyway, the point is, and he also says, but this will likely require regulation, meaning he's calling for the regulation, the legislative process to basically make beef illegal. And everybody's like, oh, you're jumping inclusion. Like, I read what the damn guy said in his interview. Bill Gates has enough money to influence these kinds of outcomes. Do you think that we're going to actually ever be in a situation where this fervor among some people, particularly on the left, and some people that are out to control your diet, do you think they ever actually get any traction, or is it just a sort of lunatic fringe? Go Jim first.
I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know, but I do know that we have a lot of urban counterparts that listen to those types of things. And unless if we can really show them why what we're doing is good and why what we're doing matters to them, there's no telling what they'll do.
Well, from the standpoint of consumption, beef is pretty well leveled off in the United States. We're still hanging around 57 pounds per American per year. Now, this last 12 months might change that because it's had a more inflationary situation. The cow herd is down. Beef prices are up even more than your normal grocery basket. So that might be an issue. But it seems to me that we have a tremendous story to tell. That as Hugh alluded to, we got 600 plus million acres that can't do anything else. It can't grow corn. It can't grow soybeans. And frankly, we don't really need any more corn. It can't grow wheat very well. So it's grazing land. And it takes an animal, a ruminant, to go out there and take cellulosic fiber and turn it into something we can digest. So we have a hell of a story to tell, but then there's the environmental part of it. And that's where I think, Jim, you come in. You're the soils guy. Are we getting an audience? Do people grasp that this is actually a net benefit, or are they just going to get hung up with whatever Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says? What's your perception?
No, I believe we're making progress every day. We're not to that tipping point yet. And that's kind of where we're trying to get to, obviously, is to a tipping point. We're not there yet, but we're making progress every day. More and more people are more and more interested from odd entities. It might be a municipality that's interested in having more water or cleaner water. And what we do on the rangeland influences that and can have a very strong positive impact on municipalities having more water and cleaner water. And so that's our story to tell.
Hugh, you've been around a while. By the way, Hugh just took, if you're listening, remember, you can also watch. The Business of Agriculture is not just an audio or available wherever you get your podcast from, all the different sources, but also it's a video on Acres TV. You can go to watchacrestv.org, or you can also go to my YouTube channel, the Damian Mason channel. Just type in on YouTube, Damian Mason channel, hit subscribe. It's free. It'll cost you nothing. And if you were watching, you would notice that Hugh just took a drink out of a big old tumbler and it had an N on it. I don't know if that's a Nebraska Is it a Nebraska? Is that a Nebraska thing you're wearing there?
Get it up there.
Oh, okay. It's Noble Ranches. That's good. I was afraid at first it was in Nebraska. I'm like, we can't talk to a cowboy that's from Nebraska. And by the way, I mean, I like the Cornhuskers, and I always tell everybody, you know what the N on the side of their helmet stands for? Knowledge.
I do know.
It stands for knowledge. Anyway, if you're a Nebraska person, yes, I just wise-appled on you, but it's all good fun. The money part of it, the person that comes out there and looks at your stuff, you can demonstrably say, by doing a better job with your rangelands, you can make more money. You can tell them that, right? You know, you're putting more weight on per animal per day, your carrying capacity goes up, et cetera. You can make that, you can make the economic argument, right?
You can make the economic argument, but it may not be weight per gain per day initially. You know, what we may see is that we have to make some changes within our management before we begin to see the benefits to the livestock. And part of that is learning to manage the livestock, learning to manage the land. So there's a bit of a learning curve. Once you get past that learning curve and really begin to manage it and understand what your objectives are, then you can begin to show it. So, you know, some of the key things that we know that we've got to do is let's make sure that we're calving and breeding in line with nature. We can do that. That cuts out a lot of your overhead, you know, a lot of your costs before you even get to the overhead.
Yep.
We want to leave more residual back to the land than we've ever done in the past. You know, we don't want to be so efficient that we can't regrow those plants quickly. So the more residual we leave, the more rapidly it's going to recover, the more rapidly we have the turnover. And then over time.
And what you mean there is you mean pull the cows off before they've nubbed it down to the dirt. And that's something that a lot of people in the old days thought, oh, you got to get every last inch. You're saying leave some residual on there and that plant will be healthier and they'll actually have more vitality and grow back more quickly, right?
It does. And the same. And then what's the recovery periods that's necessary for those plants to get to that full leaf, mature leaf stage before you go back there and regraze it again? You know, managing those things first and then worry about your grazing rotation. Yeah, you know, we all like grazing rotation, but a bad grazing rotation is no better than continuously grazing. Right. So you've got to be able to go in there and approach it. What are you keying off of? How do you know you're making a difference? And then are you doing enough monitoring to know that you're making any difference at all? I mean, I spent 26 of the 25 years of my 27 years here at Noble and 10 years running a ranch, looking across the pasture, looking down at the pasture, looking at the animals, making those decisions. But as Jim will tell you, the true test of whether you're making any improvements on your soil health is going to be looking underneath the soil. Mm-hmm. So as you begin to look at it, you look at your bottom line, look at your economics, look at your, you know, the contentment of your livestock. There's ways that you can work within the system and not feel like that you have to be in some sort of cookie cutter, industry focused outcome that really doesn't fit well for you financially for your operation.
I like it. Get me out of here, Jim Johnson. I'm interested. I think this is good. And I just, I'm wondering why why would the person not be doing more of the kind of stuff you're talking about? It doesn't seem like there's any compelling reason not to, other than I guess the excuse would be I don't have time or I don't have the resources. You're not even talking about spending money. I mean, if I want to improve my grazing lands, I might have to spend some money on seed, but after a while, the cows do it for me, right?
Right. We've identified 4 main barriers, and they're lack of knowledge. So some people still just don't know. They're doing the best they can.
That's knowledge with an N. That's knowledge with an N for anybody.
Another is lack of guides and mentors. There are a lot of people that are very interested and they just don't know where to turn to for help. A third is economic uncertainty and ongoing risk. If you're looking at making changes, you know as well as we do, these are million and multi-million-dollar operations that we're looking at changes. And the uncertainty and the risk there is a very real thing that keeps people awake at night. And so if we can eliminate some of that. And then fourth is just society and cultural influences. If you go and talk to your dad or brother or son or cousin and they all say, no, that'll never work. You've got to do it the way we've always done it. That's a tough row to hoe.
Most people don't have the backbone to go against the conventional or go against the crowd. I mean, obviously, the last few years has taught us that it's very difficult to go against the grain, and most people don't have the wherewithal to do it. But you know what? You just told us the 4 reasons that that people do not do this, and you've also made a very compelling case for why we should be doing this. If people want to learn more about this, if maybe somebody has one of those 600 plus million acres and they want to do a better job with it, how do they find you?
Noble.org, NOBLE.org.
And it's Noble Research Institute. They're in Ardmore, Oklahoma, and they're helping you graze a better plot of land. And I think it's good for everything, the soil, the environment, and your bottom line. And you know what? I'm happy to have you guys on here because I'm a beef eater, and I know that many of my people that listen to this are beef eaters also. So you know what? Eat beef and feel like you've done something good for the environment, contrary to what you're being told by Bill Gates and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. His name is Hugh Aljoe, and the other guy here is Jim Johnson. Thanks for being on.
Thanks so much for having us.
It's been a pleasure, and it's always a pleasure to listen to you.
I appreciate you saying that. And by the way, there's 300 plus episodes. If you liked what you heard here, go ahead and go back and listen to some other ones. And again, watch it on my YouTube channel or watch it on Acres TV. Till next time, thanks for being here. I'm Damian Mason, and this is The Business of Agriculture. Well, that concludes another fantastic episode of The Business of Agriculture. This episode was brought to you by Pattern Ag. You know, everybody in agriculture understands the importance of soil health. We also keep an eye on our soil better than we ever did through advanced soil testing. But what if there was a company that provided predictive analytics, not just checking out nutrients and all the elements that are in there, but also could tell you the degree of risk you face with disease and pest pressure? That's right, Pattern Ag can do that. They actually can tell you, hey, you're going to have a real issue here. You can proactively treat for corn rootworm or cyst nematode or sudden death syndrome before the problem actually starts costing you yield. Go to pattern.ag, that's www.pattern.ag, to find the nearest rep that can help you start doing better for your soil.